Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And I did not advertise today's vlog in advance because I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do one today. And you can see behind me there are all kinds of boxes and envelopes in the office because I have a major mailing to do today. Which is why I wasn't sure if I would be here at this time, but I am, so I'm going to go ahead and do a vlog today. And today our subject is the Witch's Pyramid. And Peggy Kerr asks my beliefs regarding the Witch's Pyramid, so that's what we're going to discuss. And the Witch's Pyramid consists of four words: to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. So four parts. It's actually a number more words, obviously, but four parts, and those four parts are the four walls of the pyramid. There is also a secondary ceremonial form that has a fifth part, but I'm not even going to go there. I'm just going to discuss the traditional pyramid, and I want to talk about how it came to be or how it came into existence. The Witch's Pyramid was created in the mid-19th century by Eliphas Levi, the great French occultist, and was not considered the Witch's Pyramid until at least 100 years later. It was adapted into at least some versions of Wicca in the 1950s. It was no part of my personal teaching, although we'll come to how I feel about it in a few moments. As I say, it's been adapted in different forms in different branches of metaphysics, but the main form is the four parts. And how I feel about the Witch's Pyramid depends entirely on how you're using it. I would say that it was intended to be a teaching tool, and as a teaching tool, it's very good. As a statement of philosophy, I'm not so thrilled with it, for reasons we will come to. And I think a lot of people do not understand it so much as a teaching tool as a statement of philosophy. And what is the difference between these two things? Well, let's look at it first as a teaching tool. The four parts to know, well, obviously, to do a piece of magic, you need to know how to do it. And as a teaching tool, it is a diagram for how to enact a piece of magic. First, you must know the principles involved in what you're doing. If you don't know that, obviously you're working in the dark. So that's perfectly good. The second one, to dare. Obviously, you have to be willing to do the piece of magic. You have to be prepared for what is required from it to dare to do it. If you're trying to affect a major change, you have to be willing to affect that major change, even if it's a minor change. So you have to be prepared to dare to do the thing you're setting out to do. And often people aren't. So that is an important point. To will, you have to have the energy behind what you're doing to make it happen. You have to use your will to focus forward what you are trying to have happen. I hear some people try to suggest that the emphasis on will and intent is much more recent than it really is. It's very traditional, and you see it here in the Witch's Pyramid. To will what you are doing to make it happen is what actually makes it happen. And then the final wall is to keep silent. And as a teaching tool, what I understand that to mean is that when you've done your piece of magic, you want to leave it alone to work. You don't want to be re-examining it 20,000 times. You don't want to be second-guessing it. You've done it, you leave it alone. And in that sense, in that meaning, the Witch's Pyramid is great. That is a perfect description of how to do a piece of magic. Now, if we make it a philosophy, the problem I've encountered with people who do that is that they only pay attention to the fourth wall. And they use it in what I consider a negative and limiting way, which is the idea that you must not speak about anything, you must be very secretive. And, in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, when Levi created this, maybe he did mean it that way. It was a different time. This is the 21st century. We don't need to be so silent. In fact, I think it's very counterproductive to be so silent as a movement, as individuals. About a particular work of magic, even then, I see no reason to be silent about it. You don't want to worry it to death. That doesn't mean you can't say that you did it. I talk about magic all the time. One of the reasons I feel this way, my father was a ceremonialist. I've said this many times, and he had his issues as well. My mother was a Correllian. Two very different attitudes on this subject. And my father was a believer in that idea of keeping silent about magic. And he held the point of view, which was not uncommon in older traditions, that if you speak about magic, it loses its power. A point of view that my mother totally felt differently about. And I totally feel different about. I've spoken about many acts of magic with no negative consequence at all. Therefore, it cannot be true. I think that it was a prohibition that was intended to keep people safe in an era when it was more dangerous to be a magic user. If you're using the witch's pyramid in the sense of promoting that kind of idea, then I am not so fond of it. Leaving your magic alone to work? Yes, absolutely. Feeling that everything has to be secret and silent? Absolutely unnecessary. The vast majority of magic users today, and many of them historically, were nothing resembling silent. So if you understand it in that sense, separate from your actual act of magic, but as part of the lifestyle, I don't think it's a good thing. So I would say that my understanding and my feelings about the witch's pyramid depend entirely on how you're using it. If you're using it as a teaching tool that defines how an act of magic takes place, well, then it's great. If you're making it into something else that it wasn't really meant to be, then I don't think it's a good thing. So how does your act of magic work? Well, the witch's pyramid describes it beautifully. But as a lifestyle, silence is not really good. And as someone who spent early years in it and dealt with people who observed it, I have to tell you it's very frustrating, and it really is not necessary today. Maybe for certain individuals because of their particular circumstances, but in many cases, I think if they were to address their circumstances, they would change that. Now, another aspect was brought up to me before actually doing the vlog, and that is the idea of being silent in a different sense, that you don't need to talk about everything, that it's good to keep your own counsel, that you don't want to be constantly gibbering away everything that you're doing. And I would agree with that. I am a great believer in discretion, a great believer in diplomacy. And so if that's what you mean, well, that's another thing altogether. It is good not to say everything that comes into your head. In fact, saying everything that comes into your head is very counterproductive in my experience, because I've known people who do that, and it tends to undercut them in many ways. So if that's what you mean by silence, that's another thing again. So in the end, what I would say is it depends on how you're using it. But to know, to dare, to will, to keep silent as a description of an act of magic specifically, it's a teaching tool for how to do it, and understanding silence in the sense of not worrying it to death afterwards, well, that I would endorse. That I think is good. If you're using it in a different way, I am not so thrilled with it. But then, I have been a public pagan since I was 13 years old. I went all through junior high and high school as a public pagan. I've gone through my whole life as a public pagan. So I suppose it stands to reason that I would not endorse the idea of silence as a lifestyle or secrecy as a lifestyle. And I've had very little negative consequence from it. Um, Probably in part because of my life circumstances, probably in part because of how I present myself and how I go about my life. And because I do also have discretion. Being public and being indiscreet are not necessarily the same thing. Um, I was never the person whose first introduction was going to be, "Hello, I'm Reverend Don, I'm a witch." Um, if I'd never met the person before, and if it was not a metaphysical circumstance. I am a great believer in the idea that you let people get to know you um, before you get to that sort of thing. The late Pete Pathfinder Davis, who I had the great privilege of having a friendship with and having as a mentor when I was quite young, would often speak about that you show yourself as a good and positive person first, and then let people get to know the more controversial aspects or what they might find controversial, because they're already prepared to see you as a good person at that point. So being public and being indiscreet are not necessarily the same thing, but being silent is something entirely different as a lifestyle. And I think that it's very destructive both to the individual and to the movement. So those are my thoughts. I hope you find them helpful. And until next time, may you blessed be. And if you like the vlog, please remember to hit like, share, or subscribe according to the platform that you're on. And thank you for watching. And until next time, may you blessed be.